Oh, that was beautiful, 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 beautiful. So I'm just setting up the streaming. Are you okay, Cliff, if we stream this to YouTube
Sure.
or Facebook? Yeah, just right.
But then
So
they'll find me. Then they'll find me.
that's the idea. Cliff Berg. What was the title of this again, Cliff? Just I'll type it in. It was
Why Agile? Oh, the silent majority. Why Agile needs a hard pivot.
should have called it the Silent Running.
That was a good movie.
It was Huey,
Long
Louie, and
time
Dewey.
ago. Yeah.
I
And there
think
was
that's
a Star Trek episode based on that.
yeah. Right. Hi guys, thanks for coming today. We're just putting this on to and we're going to go live. So welcome Facebook as well. I'm going to pivot back to the screen. Hello everybody, how are you doing? And we're going to admit more people. So that's 33 people we've got. That's a nice number. And we have people from all over the world. I could recognize a few names of people, and so thanks everyone for coming along today to hear from Cliff. Now, those of you who were at the opening ceremony, will remember that Cliff was there. I'm going to let a few more people in, yeah, because we've still got more people coming in, and it'd be good to get more people in before we start. So. And then I'll introduce you. So what would be really good if in the chat people could, put in, I guess three questions I love, and it's, who you are, because I want to know who you are, because I always like to know who's here. Where you are, because this is a global festival, and one of my KPIs are that we're getting people from all over the world and building bridges between people. And why you're here, just because I'm curious. I am just, pathologically curious. So, are you here because you think that Agile needs a pivot? Are you here because you you enjoyed Cliff at the opening ceremony and you want to hear some more? Did you come for the Star Trek intro? And we're adding some more people. Right, I'm going to tell a little bit of story. So when I was setting up the festival, I reached out to my network, and at that time Cliff wasn't in my network, and I didn't know Cliff. I didn't know anything about Cliff, or I didn't know anything about Cliff's work or anything. And I reached out to a great guy, John Johnson, that I'd met in Dublin when we were out with the Flow guys. So the guys that do the lighthouse thinking in Dublin, and Johnny came over from the US, and we went out for Guinness, and had a great time. And so we always remained friends. And when I was setting this up, he said, "You really need to get Cliff." And I said, "Who's Cliff?" So you really need to speak to Cliff. So he got us in contact, and almost like one of the first people about this festival, we spoke about the festival, and I outlined we'd like to put a global festival together, get people from all around the world in, and I think Cliff listened politely, didn't know who the hell I was, said good luck. Didn't think it didn't. I don't think at that time it was interesting. And then I think Cliff would be quiet for a little while, and then later on, we hooked up again. So yeah, Cliff, when the Mad Scotsman phoned you, what did you think?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm quite impressed with what you've put together. I think it's staggering. I've never seen such an aggregation of thoughtful content in an event context. So my hat's off to you. Yeah, thank you for pulling this together, Scott, and all those who helped you.
Yeah, and it's been a community thing. I mean, there's you'll know from you're in the Slack group. There's a lot of people involved. If you hear any screaming in the background, it's homeschooling, I believe. Could be home punishment. I don't know. Yeah. So let's turn over. I'm really interested in this topic. I think that where we go in the future is really important. That's why I asked you to do the opening wish, and really excited to hear what you're going to say. So do you want to tell folks a little bit about your about your history, why you're why you're here, and I'm going to go and have a look at the chat to see who's here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Scott. So I just have to confess that when Scott asked me to give the opening wish with regard to the future, my thought was, well, why are you picking an old guy for the future? Although I try to stay healthy. I think I have a lot of years left. But I feel like, when the Agile Manifesto came out, I was 20 years into my career. And I had a pretty successful company, about 200 people. And we converted to extreme programming. Kent Beck's book, Extreme Programming Explained, had just come out. And one of my project managers came to me and said, look, one of our architects is saying, we should do this. And so we did. And it worked really well. And we became an Agile company. So we were early adopters. And I ended up writing a book in 2005 about Agile for high assurance systems. It's called High Assurance Design. And anyway, so that's history. So but when the Agile movement started, I felt like finally, because the 1990s was like a methodology craze. Before the 1990s, if you had a software project, you didn't use a methodology. You tried to find a quote unquote good project manager. And it was like an art. It was like a black art. If you didn't find a good project manager, you were dead. If you found a good project manager, you would have success. And that's kind of how it was. And in the 1990s, PMI, other organizations and people came out with methodologies and tried to make it into a cookbook process. And that didn't work. We ended up with waterfall. Waterfall was unknown in 1980, 1985. No one did that. It really came into the foreground in a big way in the mid 90s, when you started to see a lot of procurement offices would craft project structures in the context of a waterfall. And then big organizations copied that and created methodology teams, and they all came up with waterfall methodologies. That happened in the 90s. Before that, it wasn't like that. And I was on a lot of teams in the 80s and early 90s that were extremely agile. Continuous automated testing every day, servant leadership, incremental development, extremely agile in the 1980s. So when the Agile Manifesto came out, it really was like a course correction. It was like, hey, forget this waterfall stuff. Let's go back to what we know works from a long time ago. And one thing that troubled me was, I was CTO of my company, and it was my job. We built big stuff, not little websites. We built stuff for IBM and McKesson Pharmaceuticals, Federal Express, Capital One Bank. We built enterprise class stuff, and it had to work. And it was my job to make sure it really worked. And I was a little disconcerted that the Agile community was on this bandwagon of just throw stuff out there, because to me, Agile was about continuous risk management. It was about putting things out there carefully and doing a lot of testing in an automated way and in a continuous way. And I didn't see a focus on that. That later became DevOps, but the Agile community wasn't interested in the risk management side of it, which is really important if you're making stuff that's complicated or stuff that has to have high reliability. And one of the few Agilists, and Scott Ambler gave one of the introductory wishes, and my hat goes out to him because he was one of the early Agile writers who was talking about turning risk management from bureaucratic process into a real-time process. How does Google deploy every day and know that their stuff works? How does Amazon do that? They deploy 1,000 times a day. How could they do that if they weren't managing risk in a real-time way, using highly robust, high coverage automated testing and other practices? It's really about making risk management real-time and scalable. And the early Agile community wasn't interested in that. So I've been watching for a long time, and things have come full circle. The Agile community has started to embrace this in the context of DevOps and a lot of other things. So I feel like the future is the past, but in a different way. Cloud services have completely changed things because commodity virtualization made it possible to scale horizontally and to introduce self-provisioning, automated provisioning of resources on demand. That changes completely how you can do continuous risk management. So anyway, that's a little bit of background. Let me get into the actual talk. And this talk is about something called Agile2, which I'm not going to get into too much, but I'm going to try to make the case for Agile2. And what Agile2 is Agile2 is saying, this is what a lot of people think Agile should have been. And it is, for people who do Agile well, this is what they do. It's not new. People who understand this stuff deeply and know how to do this at scale, when they read Agile2, they say, well, yeah, of course. That's what I've been thinking for a long time. I know that. It's not new to them. So Agile2 is an attempt to actually put a stake in the ground about things that a lot of people know already, but kind of isn't part of the Agile narrative. And we feel it needs to be part of the standard Agile narrative so that people who are learning Agile at scale, and when I say Agile, I include DevOps and I include participatory design and all the things in the delivery stream and a value stream that make products work and are the right products. I mean, all of that stuff. People who know that, Agile2 resonates with them. So Agile2, let me share my screen. Okay, yeah, what we didn't want to do is create another manifesto or another thing that was just, okay, let me go into present mode. Okay, I assume people can see my screen. Why Agile2 is needed. There's going to be another talk next week that gives kind of an overview of Agile2 and what its elements are, but this is about why do we need it and what's the scope of it? So, there was a debate today actually on LinkedIn with Daniel Mezek and some other people. He wrote a book on open spaces and is really quite thoughtful, the Open Leadership Network founder. And he pointed out that the term Agile is very ambiguous, which it is. And Dave Thomas, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, has said repeatedly in talks that he doesn't like that Agile now has a capital A and he thinks it's an adjective. And he should know because he was one of the authors of the manifesto. Well, unfortunately, language moves beyond the original creator of the term. The reality today is now there are two different words, Agile with a little a and Agile with a big A. And Agile with a little a you can find in Webster. It's an adjective. And it means you're nimble and quick, which can apply to an organization. But Agile with a big A definitely is a word. There's no question about it. And but the scope of that word, just like if you say, well, someone's an introvert or someone's an extrovert, it's not clear cut. It's very gray. And Agile is the same way. When you say Agile, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes under that umbrella. The Agile Manifesto is definitely in there because the Agile Manifesto has, in some ways, stood the test of time. It's proven that it's an insightful document. Although I have real problems with it. I think it's got flaws, some pretty big flaws, but it's a brilliant document and it's worthy of reading and trying to understand it today, even after 20 years. Another thing that's usually part of Agile is these Agile frameworks, in particular the kind of core frameworks like Scrum and Kanban and XP. Those are unquestionably part of Agile. even if you use one of them or like one and don't like the others, they're all part of what people mean when they say agile and agile thinking and agile ideas. And there also are lots of practices that agile coaches generally advocate, like the agile team room, which I think is awful, but it's part of that grab bag of practices. The roles defined by Scrum, which have become kind of standard roles that people talk about even if they don't use Scrum, product owner, Scrum master, and so on. The idea of agile stories, which I always forget where that term came from, but the term agile story has become pretty general. Test-driven development, which I also do not like, and is not the same as test-first development. Test-driven development is very specific to unit testing. It's a development process that relies on unit testing. And behavior-driven development, these are things, and there are many more. There's a long list of things that generally are seen as part of the grab bag of agile practices. So if someone says, well, what's agile? Well, it's a lot of different things. It's not one thing. It's not just the manifesto. It's also the agile community and the thinking of people in the agile community. And if you ask people about agile, if they've had experience with agile, you get very different answers depending on who you ask. And this is an experiment I've been doing for a long time. If you ask agile coaches and people in the agile community about agile, you get one set of answers. And if you go into a programmer forum and ask programmers or business analysts or a lot of other roles, you get very, very different answers. The agile community, consisting of agile coaches, which includes me, they generally think it's great and it's getting better all the time. It's like the best thing ever created, even though agile ideas have a long history that go way back before the Agile Manifesto. They're great ideas, and they feel that the agile movement is going strong and it is very healthy. I disagree, and that's why we have this talk. But let's get into that. If you ask developers, which I do, you often get, it's about 50-50. Some of them feel, yes, it's a good process. I have issues with some things, but I think it's good overall. But the other half, a very large percent, think it sucks. Especially if you talk to engineers and people who work in high assurance systems like aircraft design and software development for real-time systems, which is very common. A lot of software developers don't realize how prevalent that is. All products today pretty much have software in them, whether you're talking about a car or a toaster or whatever. And so hardware products with embedded software is very, very, very ubiquitous. So you can't look at it and say, well, that's just that stuff on the margin. No, it's the mainstream. It predominates. And it's engineers who design and build that stuff, and software is part of it. And those communities generally look very mistrustfully at Agile. They're not happy with it. Now, why is that? Is it because the Agile ideas are not right? Or is it because they're doing it wrong? Well, it's complicated. But in any case, we know there's a problem because it's not working for them. And one of the core ideas of the Agile community, which is a good idea, is that you need T-shaped people, where, most people can do anything on a team. And whenever I hear a team, I'm always troubled because unless you're building something trivial, it takes more than a team. It takes lots of teams. And yes, you do want the teams to try to become autonomous, but that takes time and you never really get there. It's an aspiration. Teams have to interact, so you never have just a team, or unless you're building like a little website, it's always the teams. And you need experts. You need experts who are providing expertise that you cannot just easily transfer. There are two kinds of machine learning in use today. One is commodity machine learning, where you use an off-the-shelf tool from Amazon or Google or Microsoft, and you just apply that. But if you're doing machine learning where you have to build your own model, your own neural network model, you need PhD people for that. And those are mathematicians, they're not software engineers. They can code, but it's not what they do. What they do is develop neural network models. And they just want to run those models. And those models don't run in Python or whatever, they run in GPUs. But anyway, the important thing is there's a lot of technology today that needs to manifest as software, and software teams need to be able to work with experts. And being an expert is not bad. The Agile community seems to view an expert as a pathology. Like that person is still an expert, they haven't learned to be a generalist yet. That's not the right way to look at it. You need experts and you need generalists and you need T-shaped people. For complex products, you need a whole blend depending on what the product is, and you need to figure out how to make that work in terms of a delivery stream. So how did this happen? How did we end up with this disconnect where, you know, these communities of people have such divergent viewpoints on how well things are doing? Well, you know, everyone is trying their best. It's no one's fault. It's just kind of a system thing that has happened with the community. You know, it's, you know, the Agile community is like a ship that's sailing and it's just going off on its own and there's no one driving it. It goes where it will go. And, you know, so some bad things have happened to it, which is troubling to me because I'm an Agilist and I feel Agile needs to work. We need Agile. So, you know, Agile2 is really trying to like rescue some things about Agile. So, you know, in developing Agile2, we put together a team of 15 people. And the first thing that we did was try to understand why these things were happening. And one of the core dysfunctions of the community is the tribalism, where we have these different groups, you know, the Scrum group and the Kanban group and you know, SAFe and LESS and all that. And, you know, those are frameworks, those are fine by themselves, but sometimes people who embrace those frameworks are too dogmatic. They identify personally with the framework. That's a red flag. If you feel you identify personally with a particular framework, question that. Do some introspection and some reflection on that. Because the danger is that if you embrace and identify with a framework, then the framework becomes correct by definition. And you stop listening to people who challenge it, and you become dogmatic. Another thing that, and I'll get into that a little bit, another thing that is wrong is there are some things that are wrong about the Agile Manifesto. Yes, I said it. There are some things that are wrong, especially if you read it literally, which of course people will. Unless you're very experienced and know better, you're going to read it literally. And there are some things that are not right. My favorite example is the best communication is face-to-face. No, it's not. It depends. Sometimes it is. If you want to know, like, what's the square root of 2? Yeah, maybe the best thing is just ask someone 1.4. I don't remember anymore. I used to know it's 8 digits. But if you want to talk about, like, hey, we have 12 repos and we need to figure out the best the best branching and merging approach for this product. What you don't want to do is just get everybody in a room and try to talk that through, because you'll go in circles because it's too complicated. What you want to do is ask people to write their thoughts down and circulate that, and have a couple of exchanges in writing, and then get together in a room. But don't get together in a room off the bat for a very complex subject. It won't work most of the time. Maybe it will sometimes, but usually it won't work that well. So the Agile Manifesto clearly says, as an absolute, the best form of communication is face-to-face. Well, sometimes, but sometimes not. It's not correct. That's wrong. It's an absolute statement. Absolute statements usually are not true. Usually important things are missing. My favorite one is data. How could they not mention anything about data? Data was usually important in 2001. It's 100 times more important today. How could they leave that out? My God. And the ramifications of that are huge. You have teams thinking they're doing what they should be doing, and they've completely ignored the entire concept of data and thinking about data. A question for an Agile coach, have you sat down with developers and said something like, forget frameworks. What do you think would be the best process? Have you done that? If you haven't done that, I recommend you do. I recommend you get a bunch of people in a room and said, I want you to erase Scrum and Kanban and SAFe and all that stuff from your mind. Given your experience, what do you think is the best way for us to do stuff? And see what they say. I bet it will look quite different from these frameworks most of the time. Have you reflected on some of the accepted Agile practices that we just take for granted, like open space offices? And have you noticed that there's a huge pushback on that? If you Google open plan office, it'll be page after page after page of article and criticism and why it's horrible. And yet, for Agile teams, we keep doing that. Why? Why do we keep doing that? Is the Agile community not listening to all of the reaction that's happening around that? Or is it in a thought bubble? Is it subject to mob thinking where, it's just as kind of this is how it's supposed to be, and this is what we're going to keep doing because this is how you do it. Are we really thinking for ourselves? Are we really listening to what works for people? And are we accepting that works for some people doesn't work for other people? Have you taken an interest in how teams do their work? Are you only focusing on their process or on something? In order to work effectively in an Agile ecosystem, you have to know the entire delivery stream and the entire value stream, which are not the same thing. And you have to know it all. You don't have to be an expert in all of it, but you have to have some understanding of how it all works together. If you only know one aspect, you have an incomplete picture and you cannot collaborate effectively. People have to understand the delivery stream. And so, if you're technical, it behooves you to ask about the product and how people use it. If you're oriented around the process, which many Agile coaches are, I would say all Agile coaches, have you asked about the technical practices and try to understand that? If you don't understand, ask questions, read a book, take the training course. You don't have to be an expert, but you have to know how the pieces work, how they fit together. If you don't know how the teams are doing their job, you have a very incomplete picture of their day and their challenges. These tribes are the biggest problem because it freezes people in their thinking. And it's just like different political parties. They each mock and mischaracterize the other, deriding the other by oversimplifying and parodying what the other side cares about, and so that it sounds comical and ridiculous. And so there's no sharing of thinking among the tribes. Tribalism is probably the biggest problem with humanity. Forget Agile. It's the thing that's in our DNA that we need to all recognize is there and put an X over it and recognize when we're being tribal and step back and say, look, I have cognitive ability where I can override my natural inclinations and not be tribal. Tribalism locks us into these rigid frameworks. And as I said, people they start to identify with the framework and with the tribe. And then, then the framework is seen as correct by definition. And so if someone challenges it, then their challenge is illogical. It must be wrong because the framework cannot be wrong. That's very damaging thinking. And what happens And what has happened is that freezes the evolution of Agile thinking. And that's exactly what happened. That's why DevOps arose as a separate thing. The first person talking about continuous delivery at conferences, Jez Humble, was an Agilist, is an Agilist. He identifies strongly with Agile. In his seminal book, Continuous Delivery, he mentions the word Agile more than 40 times. I counted them. And yet he would go to Agile conferences in the mid-2000s, and the events were well attended, but it completely was ignored by the Agile community at large. No one paid attention. And so DevOps became a separate movement. The word DevOps got attached to it around 2009. And then he came out with his book, and Gene Kim came out with a book in 2013 and became DevOps. And today, if you talk to a DevOps person, they know what an Agile coach is, and they know what a Scrum Master is, but that's pretty much it. And if you talk to an Agile person, an Agile coach, they know the word DevOps, but they couldn't tell you the first thing about continuous delivery and why that's important. That's very, very dysfunctional. How can that be? How, and the reason it happened is because the Agile community got locked into a certain set of practices and ideas and kept looking inward at itself instead of looking outward. And it got frozen around those ideas. And it wasn't until DevOps started become a significant thing in its own that it challenged Agile. And now they're sort of knitting back together really slowly, but they need to be unified. You have to know both, because it's about how to build products. And also the whole user experience thing is another thing that Agile really disrupted, but is finally coming back into Agile. Dogma and extremes. So some very common dogma and extremes that you hear. Self-organizing teams are best. Well, not necessarily. No, it depends. Sometimes it depends. Are they able to solve? Is it a group of experienced people, and are there no personality conflicts? If they can self-organize well, then yes, they'll kick ass. But don't take it for granted. The idea, always let them self-organize. That's very bad advice. That's poor leadership. What you should be doing is talking to people and learning what their abilities are, and then asking them if they do self-organize, how will they do that? And then kind of look at what they start doing, and then be ready to intervene and ready to step in if it's not going in a good direction. Once they've proven that they can, get out of their way. But don't take it for granted. Another thing, all leadership roles are bad, because Scrum has no explicit roles except for product owner and Scrum Master. Well, why? So if you have a large organization, you can't have any managers. Well, Google tried a flat organization. After 1 year, they said this doesn't work. So structure and leadership are really important. What's bad is toxic autocratic leadership. That's what's bad. Leadership in itself is not bad if it's the right kind of leadership directed in the right ways. Agile2, the Agile2 book in particular, has a lot on that, but people have written about leadership for thousands of years. I suggest, to really re-examine leadership, because the Agile community has kind of ejected leadership as something that we don't need. And yet it's the most important thing of all. Having the right kinds of leadership is the most important thing for any collective human endeavor. The idea that managers are bad. Managers aren't bad. A manager is just a leader who has explicit authority and accountability over people or resources. That's all a manager is. So there's some really good managers, and there's some really bad managers. I've worked for some really bad managers. But manager, the term itself, is not bad, and somehow the Agile community treats it as if it's bad. That's a dysfunction. T-shaped people are the ideal. Well, it depends. So Netflix has a technical team that helps development teams get things set up. Those people aren't T-shaped. They're experts. They help teams of T-shaped people get set up, but the people who work on that tools team are not T-shaped. They are down in the weeds, geeky experts. So no, T-shaped people are not the ideal. It depends on the context. Autonomous teams are best. Well, yes, that's true if a team is able to operate autonomously, which is almost never the case. And if you just embrace that model of autonomous teams are best, you're likely to forget that you need structure outside the team. You need an orchestrator. And I don't necessarily mean an individual, but you need an entity or an active presence that helps teams to coordinate or to catalyze this coordination. That needs desperate attention in multi-team settings. What that can look like is a matter of creativity, but it needs to be there. And it needs to be there at every level of a product, from the feature to the product to the platform in which the many products operate. Face-to-face is always best. It depends. It depends what you're talking about. And it depends who's talking. If you talk to an extrovert, they'll say, yeah, let's just get in a room and talk it through. If you ask an introvert how they want to discuss something, they'll say, well, leave me alone for a while. I want to go think about this, and then maybe let's talk tomorrow. So they want to first think it through, and maybe they want to write some notes or write their thoughts down. So people work differently. Thinking is a very important part of communication and collaboration. We often forget that. Collaboration involves talking and listening, reading and writing, and thinking. You have to have all, and for a complex topic, you need all 5 of those. No team role other than team member. Well, okay, so that means no one ever advances in their career. So there are no senior developers. So experience doesn't count for anything. That's not very good. It's ironic to me because the Agile Manifesto, the very first value, begins with the word individuals, not teams. And somehow the Agile community has devalued the individual and people's individual differences. And that's a dysfunction. Collaboration at the expense of focus. So, here's the Agile team room. I've been in Agile team rooms. Once in a while, I go on a project and work on a project just so I stay in touch with how people are working. And whenever I've been in this open plan situation, I just cannot focus. I cannot think deeply. Sometimes I've had to actually take my work home. This is before the pandemic. And this is why people in these open plan offices wear headphones. It's not because they want to listen to music. It's because they're trying to drown out the noise. They're trying, if you're trying to focus on something, you have 5 balls in the air in your head, and someone walks by and starts chatting to someone. Basically, you stop thinking. You stop thinking until they're done. It's horrible. It's a horrible situation for being able to think deeply. If you're not thinking deeply, if you're doing stuff that really doesn't require your full mind, it's no problem. But if you have a hard problem you're trying to crack, forget it. It's, and again, some people are different. I had a roommate a friend in college, she could be thinking, you could have cannons going off in the room and she was totally focused. Other people, you drop a pin on the floor and they say, what was that? And you've completely shattered their thoughts. And there's a lot of evidence that this is related to introversion and extroversion, that introverted people have more sensitive nervous systems and are more susceptible to distraction. But anyway, it's just Google open plan office and you'll see it's not popular. Talking as the only way to collaborate. Talking is very important as a way to collaborate. but it's not the only way people collaborate. And it's generally introverted people do not like these big group, real-time, big, chaotic, ad hoc discussion formats. They hate it. They run from it. And somehow the Agile community has been embracing this one size fits all, and it's not bad by itself, but it works for a certain type of personality and it does not work for other people. Some of the incorrect ideas, product owner role, where did that come from? Well, Scrum, but there's an interesting talk by John Schrag on the internet, who's a user design. He was on he worked for, what was her name? The first person who wrote about dual track design back in 2000, he worked for her, well, before she wrote about that, on a user experience team. And this was before Agile. And then the Agile Manifesto came out, and it basically destroyed the ability of the product design team to work with the development teams. It improved the way the development teams work, but the product design teams pretty much got pushed to the side. And it took a long time for them to plug themselves back in. The whole product owner role is a dysfunction. It's the way it's defined and the way it tends to operate. Where's the user? Why would you expect that this product knows what the product owner knows what the product's supposed to do? Why would you think that? Another thing is, processes like Scrum assume a one-directional flow of one person dictating, I want the product to do this and I want it to do that. Just tell me, give me a story point estimate, but this is what I want it to do. Well, a lot of products have a very large technical aspect to them, and who would know better how to use that technology than the technical teams? But it's assumed in the Scrum process, at least, that there's this one directional flow of ideas, that it goes from the product owner to the teams who then just implement. That's a dysfunction. And some usually important things that are missing: the user, data, and leadership. Even though the Agile Manifesto uses the word user and it uses the word customer sort of interchangeably and multiple times, they've somehow been left out. Except, again, people who do this well have figured this out and have added it back in. And that's what I would encourage you to do. You need to have frequent interaction with real users or beta users, but people who actually are in the headspace of what the user is doing, to understand the job to be done by the user, what the user is trying to accomplish. Products should empower users, not replace them. And if you don't include the user in the thinking of ideas for what the product should do, you're really missing out. And data is huge from at least 3 different perspectives. That's a whole topic on its own. And leadership is the most important thing of all. And a lot of people in the Agile community have realized that. And that's why if you look at the training roadmap for business agility at IC Agile, it's all about leadership. And if you look at the DevOps Agile Skills Association, they're developing a huge curriculum around leadership. If you look at Jez Humble and Nicole Forsgren's book on DevOps Accelerate, there's a chapter on leadership. Leadership is hugely important. It's just dismissing it like, oh, we just self-organize. That's a kindergarten view of how things need to work. Agile has some really good ideas in it. And we cannot lose those, even though they're often misinterpreted. The manifesto has problems. There's things it says that are not correct, and it says things sometimes in an extreme way. And it's often interpreted in a extreme way, but someone who's experienced, who reads the manifesto will say, you know, they're not saying it right, but I know what they really mean. And it's a great, you know, it's not a good rule of thumb, but it's a good reminder list. It's a good list of things to think about. Well, remember to think about this. Remember to think about that. Not to do what it says, but to remember to think about those things. That's what it's best for. If you look at it that way, it's a very helpful document, but it's not complete. It's missing big things. You know, one thing that's valuable from it is self-organization is valuable, but it's not easy to do. It's not. You know, there are lots of books about that. Steve Marquette's book, Turn the Ship Around, and you know, there's a management practice that goes back to the 1800s called mission command, which comes from the Prussian army, from a military unit, military organization. And the basic idea is empower the people in the field, let them make their own decisions, let them figure out how to get the work done. But before you do that, first assess them. Go talk to their leaders and look at the troops and look at how well equipped they are, look at what they're capable of doing. And then you can tell, are they ready to make their own decisions? You know, self-organization is not something you just throw a bunch of people out of college into a group and say self-organize. There's so many ways that can fail. I encourage people to look at leader-member exchange theory for one of the most important failure modes of doing that. Conversation and real-time collaboration are important elements of work. One cannot write everything down ahead of time. Yeah, so that really comes from the 1990s practice that emerged where companies would hire consulting firms to create a requirements doc and then throw that out for bids for companies to then build to the requirements. What an awful, horrible way to do things, you know? And so the Agile Manifesto really is trying to say, don't do that. We need to be able to talk to the people who understand the requirements. We need to collaborate with them. And we won't really understand what you're trying to do until we write it down ourselves in our own words. Results prove progress, documents do not. You know, that's about the best measure of progress is working software. What they're really trying to say is, we don't trust anything unless actually we see it doing something. That's good. Although I would say outcomes are more important. You know, if you have a lot of working software, but it does what people don't want it to do, you still haven't accomplished anything. Divide work up into small increments, continually reflect, tell it like it is, transparency, let people decide how to do their work. Those are all great things. Agile is essential. One thing that I see, and when I go into organizations today, is they're realizing, well, we need Agile, but we need DevOps. And then they ask, well, can we get both? Are there Agile people who know DevOps? And the answer is always no. So that creates a problem for them because, you know, they might think, well, we need some key roles for the teams so we can get an Agile person or Agile coach or Scrum Master, or we can get a DevOps engineer. You know, we'd like a DevOps coach, but there are too few of those and we can't afford them. So we'll get a DevOps engineer. And then they realize, well, that's too many cooks. We'll just get one of those. And so what do they go with? The Agile coach or the DevOps engineer. Right now, they're mulling that over. Organizations aren't sure what to do. The risk is that they start to go with the DevOps person and say, well, we'll just do without Agile. We have DevOps. DevOps has become almost entirely about technical practices. Where's the human side, which is really important. You know, so we need to bring them back together. We need to bring Agile and DevOps back together. Agile2 attempts to do this, not by repeating DevOps and all that stuff. It doesn't do that at all. Agile2 is very non-technical. But what Agile2 basically says is open yourself up to these many different sets of ideas and try and synthesize them. And think about leadership model. What kinds of leadership models will work for your organization and what you're trying to do? Think about data, and think about the product. Forget this like funnel of requirements from a product owner. Think about the user and the product, and how much the users are involved. So it tries to explicitly add in some of these missing things and add back some of the balance and completeness to Agile. So I'm not going to get into Agile2 here. And one thing about Agile2 I want you to know is that it's not another manifesto. It was not written like to get people all worked up, because the original Agile Manifesto was kind of like a burn the waterfall at the stake document. Agile2 is not like that. And it's not a short list of maxims, like collaboration is good. People are central. It's not kind of like a short list of short inspirational memes. It's not like that at all. We have that. The Agile Manifesto is that. The Agile Manifesto is great. It's flawed, but it's great. And we have the Agile community. We've got a lot of great ideas, but we need to think about them with a clear lens. And the Agile2 tries to provide clarity to a lot of Agile ideas, and it tries to bring balance back. And it's a very thoughtful document. It's long. There's a lot of stuff in it. It rolls up into a set of principles, but what we're really proud of is we didn't just list these principles without supporting them as just taken on face value, just taken because we said so. Agile2 provides all the thinking that went into the principles so you can understand the reasoning, and which helps you understand if they apply to your situation. So it's intended to be a thoughtful discourse. It's not intended to be another manifesto. In an upcoming talk next week, on Wednesday, Lisa Cooney, who was on the Agile2 team of 15 people, will give an overview of Agile2. She will list the principles, but she'll focus mostly on the values and what they mean and why we have those. And a lot of it will be Q&A. She's not going to spend a lot of time talking. It's mostly going to be a Q&A discussion session. That's all I have.
Cliff, that was incredible. I'm the stand-in Scott. I'm the lesser Scott. Scott's had to dip out, so he'd asked me to look at the Q&A. That's opened up my eyes personally to a whole pile of things as an Agile coach, that some of which I had catalogued in the subconscious and others. And one question just to kick off was, with the manifesto coming out, I'm no zealot, so don't misread the question, but with it coming out from the lightweight movement, do you think some of those things that are missing, the data user leadership, were intentional in the hope that that would spur the cognitive juices of the newcomers to the community to find out which bits of the jigsaw puzzle were not there, and ultimately then was that the mistake, the balance between lightweight and accessibility and big missing bits like prescriptive rules for leadership? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you need both. Bumper stickers are valuable. Bumper stickers make people aware of things, but it's not sufficient. You need thoughtful discussion. You do. People need to read books. One of the problems I found with the Agile community in the 2000s, this is not true anymore. The community has changed in this regard, but my editor at Pearson even mentioned this to me. He said the Agile community is really insular, and people seem to only read books that say Agile on the cover. Yeah. And yet, they were at that time, in those days, they were, swirling around org change and how to do org change, but there's an entire community of thought around org change that was like the Agile community was unaware of. Mm-hmm. So, I think you need both. I think you need that something, I think you need a manifesto, but you also need thoughtful discussion of the nuances, because this stuff is complicated. It is. It absolutely is. Yeah. You can't just say, oh, self-organize. if you want to lead lead teams, which I have, and I'm sure many of you have, it's difficult. We're leading people. It's like leading cats.
Yeah.
There's a lot to it. And being a good leader, there are ideas that help, but it's very individual. So I don't think I think the bumper sticker being, simple approach, manifesto, I think that's very valuable. It's not sufficient. You also need deep dive, and I think the original manifesto, I think it would have been more compelling to me if they had something behind the manifesto that gave their thinking on what they were thinking with these different values and principles. I think that would have really helped a lot, because a lot of the problem is these things have been misinterpreted or applied in an extreme one-size-fits-all way. Yeah.
It's interesting, is the comment section is full of issues around factions or tribes. There's comments there about product ownership being run by 3 people, the role of PMO, the conflicts between DevOps and the Agilists. In the point you make strongly about tribalism and the dangers of it for the whole of human society, combined with a sense that people are assuming that DevOps and Agile should just self-organize together, and that, as you said, just doesn't happen on its own. Any tips on how you think the T-shaped teams ought to be working with the specialists without creating another silo or tribe?
Yeah, I think in order for a T-shaped team to work with a team of experts, you have to have some people who know both. So like machine learning is something I've experienced with in that regard. You need some people who know machine learning, who also know software development fairly well. They don't have to be the smartest or the best, but they have to have a working understanding of both, and they can help to bridge the gap. And they need to have the right leadership traits too. They can't be, a sullen person who just says, do this, do that. They have to be a bridge builder. They have to be inquisitive. So I'm a big believer in having, I guess it would call some pie-shaped people, meaning the symbol pi, to bridge teams. But I would go back to leadership. It really comes down to, because, so there's someone I know who is a manager who managed a machine learning group. And when he started, he knew nothing about it. And he was very effective. And he's a person, he purposefully doesn't keep his calendar full. He rarely attends standing meetings. He goes to meetings when there's something he wants to find out. And I once got a call from him on a Friday. He was 100 miles away. And we talked for 2.5 hours. He got someone else on the phone because he wanted to really understand something. And, so instead of going from meeting to meeting to meeting, this manager, he feels his job is to try to understand what's happening so he can make high quality decisions. I think you need someone like that, because someone like that will be inquisitive, and they'll get the machine learning expert in the room and they'll ask questions, and they'll get them in there with the software development lead and ask questions, and they'll help bring it together, and they won't just be a facilitator. They'll make their own suggestions too. So they'll say, what do you think of that? I really want to know. Is my idea stupid? They'll help to synthesize the different aspects of it. And that's a form of leadership. That's Socratic leadership.
Well, Cliff, by the speed with which the comments are coming thick and fast, you've got people's juices flowing. Tragically, the unmovable force of time has caught up with us, but I would say the volume of comments pretty much guarantees an excellent turnout on Wednesday, 24th, for the next session on Agile2. Thank you very much for your time. I see Mr. Severite's in the background. Could we all just jump off mute for a second and give Cliff a round of applause for being for bringing honest, transparent controversy and debate.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.
Very much.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone, for attending.
The kids love it too. That means it's